Who blew up Nord Stream?
Вы?
You did.
I was busy that day. Nate, I did not blow up Nord Stream. Thank you, though.
У вас лично, может быть, есть алиби.
Well, personally, you might have an alibi, but CIA doesn't have one.
Do you have evidence that NATO or the CIA did it?
Вы знаете, я не буду вдаваться в
Well,
детали.
I'm not going to go into detail, but as they say, you've got to search for someone who had interest in that. And in this particular case, you have to search not just for someone who is interested in that, but also someone who has the capabilities, because there are many people who are interested in that, but, not everyone is capable of scouring the bottom of the Baltic Sea.
But I'm confused. I mean, that's the biggest act of industrial terrorism ever, and it's the largest emission of CO2 in history. Okay, so if you had evidence, and presumably given your security services, your intel services, you would, that NATO, the US, CIA, the West, did this, why wouldn't you present it and win a propaganda victory?
В войне пропаганды очень сложно победить.
Well, it's very difficult, to achieve a propaganda victory, because the US controls all the global media. And as far as many European media are concerned, the end beneficiary in many cases are American funds, foundations. So, getting mired in that, well, this is one avenue to pursue, but it can turn out to be very expensive. And moreover, we might reveal our own sources of information without securing the end result. The whole world understands what happened, and even the American analysts speak about that publicly.
But here's a question you may be able to answer. You worked in Germany, famously. The Germans clearly know that their NATO partner did this, and it damaged their economy greatly. It may never recover. Why are they being silent about it? That's very confusing to me. Why wouldn't the Germans say something about it?
Ну, меня это тоже удивляет.
Well, I'm as confused as you are, but the current German leadership is not guided by national interests. What it's guided by is the interests of the collective West. Otherwise, it would be very difficult to explain the rationale for their action or omission to act. Well, yes, Nord Stream 1 was blown up, Nord Stream 2 has been damaged, but one of the strings is still very much alive, and you can get gas through this line, but they're not getting that. We are willing to do that, but they're not asking for that. There is another route via Poland, and Poland has shut that down. But Poland is eating from the hands of Germans. They're taking money from the European funds, whereas the biggest donor to those funds is Germany. But Poland has shut down the pipeline leading to Germany. Why did they do that? I do not understand. Or let's have a look at Ukraine. Germany is the second biggest donor after the US in terms of financial aid provided to Ukraine. Through Ukraine, there are two gas pipelines, so why wouldn't they take one of the gas pipelines? They could ask Ukraine to open that up, and they would get gas from Russia. So the Germans are giving them money, giving them weapons, so they could ask for gas from Russia in response, because otherwise they have to pay triple price for LNG. And it brings down the competitiveness of the German economy. And they've given money to Ukraine, and they could ask in recompense, for some economic support like gas. So you should ask them why they're doing what they're doing. These are incompetent people.
Well, maybe the world is breaking into two hemispheres, one with cheap energy, the other without. And I want to ask you that. If we're now a multipolar world, obviously we are, can you describe the blocks of alliances? Who is in each side, do you think?
Послушайте, Вы сказали, мир разделяется
Well,
на два
you are
полушария.
saying the world is being split into two hemispheres. It's our brain that is divided into hemispheres. One hemisphere is responsible for one field of action, the other is more creative, but still it's one brain, it's one head. And the world should be one, should be united. Security should be together, should be common, shared. It shouldn't be security just for the golden billion. And only if it's one world, then the world is going to be predictable and stable. And as long as the head is split into two, it's a disease, and a grave one too. And right now the world is suffering from this grave disease. But I think, to a large extent, thanks to sincere and honest journalism, we will be able to overcome that disease.
Well, let's just give one example, the US dollar, which has kind of united the world in a lot of ways, maybe not to your advantage, but certainly to ours. Is that going away as the reserve currency, the universally accepted currency? How have sanctions, do you think, changed the dollar's place in the world?
Вы знаете, это одна из
Well, you know, I think this is one of the gravest strategic mistakes committed by the U.S. leadership, you know, using the U.S. dollar as an instrument for foreign political confrontation, because dollar was the cornerstone of American prosperity and power, and everyone understands and understood that, because however many dollars you've printed, they go around the world. Inflation is at a minimum, I don't know, 3% or so, 4%, which is an acceptable level for the US. And you can print as many US dollars as you like. You know, because the public debt of the US is testimony to that. But be that as it may, dollar is still the cornerstone of American power across the world. But once the US leadership decided to use the US dollar as an instrument for foreign policy confrontation, once they did that, they dealt a blow to the American power. I would be loath to, you know, use for better words that are improper, but it is a very grave mistake. Look, even the American allies decrease their dollar reserves. They are starting to search for ways to shield themselves, because if the U.S. applies restrictive measures to certain countries, such as freezing assets or restrictions on transactions, then it is a very grave signal to the whole world. What did happen in Russia? Until 2022, around 80% of Russian foreign trade transactions were carried out in US dollars. And US dollar accounted for about 50% of our transactions with third countries. Whereas currently this figure has been brought down to 13% or so. But we were not the ones to prohibit the use of US dollars. This was not our goal. It was the US decision to restrict our transactions in dollars, which is absurd, especially from the point of view of the interests of the US taxpayers, because this decision has dealt a blow to the American economy, undermining the American power across the world. Incidentally, our transactions in yuan accounted just for 3% right now. We've gone up to 30% in transactions in rubles and 34% in yuan, in renminbi. So why did the US do that? I think it's self-conceit. They thought that the Russian economy would collapse, but it didn't. Moreover, look at the other oil-producing countries. They are doing the same thing. They are following our suit. They start to pay for oil in renminbi. Do they understand what they're doing in the US? What are they doing? You know, it's like undermine their own prosperity here. Ask anyone who is the thinking person in the U.S.
I think that's I think that's a fair assessment. The question is what comes next, and maybe you trade one colonial power for another, much less sentimental and forgiving colonial power. I mean, is the BRICS, for example, in danger of being completely dominated by the Chinese economy in a way that's not good for their sovereignty? Do you worry about that?
You know, these spooky stories, we've heard them before, bogeyman stories. China and us are neighbors. And, you know, you cannot choose neighbors or relatives. We share a border with them, 1,000 kilometers. This is number one. Number two, we're used to one another. We've been around for centuries. In terms of our coexistence, third, the foreign affairs philosophy of China is not aggressive. Their main tenets are about searching for compromise, for a trade-off, and we can see that. And the next point is as follows, and I try to lay it out mildly, in mild language, where I said that the volume of cooperation and trade with China keeps growing, while the pace of the growth of China's cooperation with Europe is higher, outpacing the cooperation with Russia. Just ask the Europeans, are they not afraid of being exposed to China? They might be, but you know, anyway, they want to enter the Chinese market when they face the economic issues now. They're facing economic issues now, and the Chinese enterprises and companies are tapping into the European market. And there are a lot of Chinese entrepreneurs and businesses in the US. Well, the policies are to the effect of confining. They are damaging themselves, actually. Trying to confine, limit cooperation with China, you're damaging your economy. This is a very intricate matter, and there can be no silver bullet solutions. As also regards the dollar, well, with respect to the legitimate from the perspective of the UN Charter sanctions, one should have a second thought whether to make such decisions or not.
So you said a moment ago that the world would be a lot better if it weren't broken into competing alliances, if there was cooperation globally. One of the reasons you don't have that is because the current American administration is dead set against you. Do you think if there were a new administration after Joe Biden that you would be able to reestablish communication with the US government? Or does it not matter who the president is?
Сейчас скажу, но чтобы закончить предыдущий вопрос.
Let me finish the previous thought. We have $200 billion. This is the target of myself and my friend, that of my friends Xi Jinping, the president of China. We want to reach $200 billion of mutual trade, and we have smashed that. We have exceeded that. We have around $230 billion of bilateral trade, and the Chinese statistics say that it's around $240 billion. And what is important is that it is a well-balanced type of mutual trade, mutually complementary in energy and scientific solutions and technological solutions and other things. It's well-balanced in an equilibrium. With respect to BRICS, by and large, Russia has assumed the presidency there since the start of the year. And, you know, BRICS countries are powerhouse economies rapidly developing. Oh, I hope my memory wouldn't let me down. In 1992, the G7 countries' proportion in global economy equaled around 47%. In 1992, in 2022, it slumped down to 30-something%, while the BRICS share was 16% in 1992, and now it is in excess of the G7 share in global economy, and that has nothing to do with Ukrainian developments. The global trends manifest themselves in this way. This is inevitable. This will keep happening. It's like the rise of the sun. You cannot prevent the sun from rising. You have to accommodate and adjust the United. How does the United States accommodate that? With help of force, sanctions, pressure, bombings, armed forces applied everywhere. This is about conceit. Your political elite does not understand that the world has been changing, and it is an objective process, a natural process, and you have to make proper decisions, timely decisions, to preserve its level of dominance. And such gross actions would lead to the opposite results. This is obvious today. You've just asked me whether another administration in the US would change things. It's not about the leader, the personality or administration. I had a very good relationship with George Bush, and I know that in the United States he is treated as a simple countryside guy that has little idea of things, but it's not true. And with respect to Russia, he did a lot of mistakes also. I told you about the Bucharest summit of NATO in 2008 to open doors to Ukraine, but you know, it was under Bush, and he put pressure on the Europeans. But actually I had a good personal relationship with them, interpersonal, and it was no worse than any other American or Russian or European politician. He knew what he was doing, as well as other people. I had a good relationship with Donald Trump. It's not about the personality of the leader, it's about the sentiment of the elites. If the American society has the prevalence of domination at all costs, with the help of resorting to force, things will deteriorate, keep deteriorating. But if they come to a conclusion, they come to infer that the world is changing and that is a natural process that cannot be helped, they have to adjust themselves using the advantage that the American nation still has. In this case, something will change for the better. The Chinese economy has become #1 by PPP. They have outpaced the US in volumes. And then there is India, 1.5 billion people living there. And then comes Japan, fourth, and Russia is fifth global largest economy. Last year it became the largest economy in Europe, despite all the restrictions and sanctions. Do you think it is natural? A lot of sanctions are exerted against us. We have been disconnected from SWIFT transaction system, and our ships are under sanctions. Our vessels, oil-carrying vessels, and aircraft of ours. The biggest number of sanctions in the world is applied against this country, and we have become the biggest economy of Europe over that period of time. The instruments and the policies of the United States are ineffective. So they should think what to do. If they come to understand that, I mean the elites, the ruling classes, things will improve, and the leader of the country will probably act in the interests of the voters and the decision makers at different levels.
But you're describing two different systems. You say the leader acts in the interest of the voters, but you also say these decisions are not made by the leader, they're made by the ruling classes. You've run this country for so long, you've known all these American presidents. What are those power centers in the United States, do you think? Like, who actually makes the decisions?
I don't know. America is a very complex system. On the one hand, it's conservative. On the other hand, it has been changing rapidly, and it is hard to have an idea, an exact idea of what is happening. And each state has its own legislation. Each state has its own regulation, and they can bar candidates from elections, and they have the two-tier electoral system. It is very hard to to know it quite well. There are two main parties, dominating parties, the bipartisan system, and there is the decision-making center. But anyway, look, after the collapse of the USSR, there was an erroneous, unfounded policy against Russia, the policy of pressure. NATO expansion means pressure and the backing of separatists in the Caucasus, and the ABM, the missile defense system establishment, is also about pressure. Then Ukraine was dragged into NATO. It is also an element of pressure. Why so? Because excessive production capabilities were created. Lots of think tanks and centers and Soviet studies professionals that knew no other thing, and they persuaded the political leadership that they should keep pressing Russia, mounting pressure to partition Russia, with several quasi-states on its territory, so that their aggregate potential and capability would be used for further struggle with China. This is a mistake, because there have been too many professionals dealing with the opposition to the USSR. Probably there is need for new, fresh blood and forces, and people that are forward-looking and know what is happening worldwide. Look at Indonesia, 600 million people, a huge population that you cannot turn a blind eye upon, and Indonesia is now entering the club of the leading economies, and despite all economic problems, the US has a good economic situation, and the growth rate is around 2.5%, if I'm not mistaken. But actually, if you want to provide for a good future, you have to change the approach to what has been happening. The world will anyway change, irrespective of what is the outcome of the Ukrainian situation. The world has been changing, and the pundits and experts in the US start writing that gradually the United States changes its policies to the world, but whether it's abrupt, quick and painful, or smooth and gradual, this is the question. And these are the ideas of people that are not anti-American in nature, that they are looking and tracking the global developments. And we need to have more forward-looking people that can analyze things and recommend something to the political leadership.
I just have to ask, you've said clearly that NATO expansion eastward is a violation of the promise you all were made in 1990. It's a threat to your country. Right before you sent troops into Ukraine, the Vice President of the United States went to the Munich Security Conference and encouraged the President of Ukraine to join NATO. Do you think that was an effort to provoke you into military action?
Well, we repeatedly, on many occasions, suggested that decisions to the problems that emerged in Ukraine after the coup in 2014 should be found with peaceful means, but no one listened to us. But the Ukrainian leadership that was under the American control stated all of a sudden that they would not honor the Minsk arrangements. They didn't like a thing about that, and they kept waging warfare in that territory. And the NATO military structures, tapped into the Ukrainian soil with training centers and military bases established under these guise. And in Ukraine, they proclaimed that the Russians are not an original nation, not an authentic nation, and they enacted laws that would limit the rights of the ethnic Russian and Russian speakers. Ukraine received the southeast as a gift from Russia, but all of a sudden they stated that Russians were not an authentic ethnicity there. in their totality, all these things brought about the desire to stop the war launched by the neo-Nazis in 2014 in Ukraine with the use of force.
Do you think Zelensky has the freedom to negotiate a settlement to this conflict?
I do not know the details. I can hardly judge, but I probably think he has. Well, he father was at war against the Nazis in the Second World War. I spoke with him once about that. I told him, Vladimir, why are you supporting the neo-Nazi in Ukraine today when your father fought them? It was the front line. I would soldier. I would not respond what he wouldn't say what he responded. It would be inappropriate. But you know, with respect to liberty and freedom, well, of his, he rose to power. On the, with the help of the Ukrainian expectations that he would bring peace to Ukraine. This is why he had a landslide victory. But when he rose to power, he figured that probably it would be better not to quarrel with the neo-Nazis and nationalists because they are aggressive and you can expect anything, they are loose cannon. And the second point is that the West will keep supporting those who are against Russia always because it's beneficial. So this is why he adopted this position, despite the previous promises and pledges to his people to stop the war in Ukraine. So he deceived his own voters.
But do you think at this point, as of February 2024, he has the latitude, the freedom to speak with you or your government directly about putting an end to this, which clearly isn't helping his country or the world? Can he do that, do you think?
Why not? Well, he believes himself to be head of state. He won the election, although we believe that all those things that happened after 2014 originated from the coup d'etat, and today's authorities are flawed, deficient, and, you know, he believes himself to be president, and the United States and Europe recognize him and acknowledge his status. Well, we had talks with Ukraine in Istanbul, and we nearly came to terms, and he knew about that. And Mr. Arahami, who led the negotiating team of Ukraine, still is head of Ukraine's ruling party faction in their parliament. So he still is head of that presidential faction. So he's still an MP, and he subscribed the preliminary instrument in Istanbul. And publicly later he said that we were ready to sign it, but Mr. Johnson, the then Prime Minister of the UK, came and dissuaded us to do so, saying that better go to war with Russia and they would give us anything and everything so that we would return all the lands we lost, he said. And they agreed, he said. His statement was made public. He said it publicly and openly. Can they come back to that or not? Do they want it or not? And afterwards, the Ukrainian president issued a decree prohibiting to negotiate with us. Let him strike it down. Let him repeal that decree. Whether Russia is ready, we hear these questions, but we do not decline to talk. Let him abandon and repeal this decree. And the fact that they obeyed the persuasion of the former UK Prime Minister Johnson is ridiculous and very sad, I think, altogether. As Mr. Arahami has said a year and a half ago, we could stop the warfare, but actually the British persuaded us not to do so, and we turned it down. Where is Mr. Johnson now? And the war is ongoing.
That's a good question. Where do you think he is, and why did he do that?
Hell knows. This was a mainstream idea. Everybody was delusioned that Russia could be defeated at the battlefield. This was about self-assurance, conceit, and very little reason. This was with the whole heart, but with little reasoning.
You've described the connection between Russia and Ukraine. You've described Russia itself a couple of times as orthodox. That's central to your understanding of Russia. You've said you're orthodox. What does that mean for you? You're a Christian leader by your own description. So what effect does that have on you?
Well, you know, as I mentioned previously, in 988, Prince Vladimir underwent baptism as his grandmother Olga had done, and then his armed troops also got converted, and then other Russians converted into Orthodox Christianity. It took some time, and then it put some roots, very deep roots, in the minds of Russian people. When Russia expanded, taking in other nations and peoples professing Judaism, Islam, Buddhism, Russia was always very loyal to those who followed other religions, and this was the source of Russia's power. There's no doubt about that. All world religions I have mentioned, and which are also traditional religions of the Russian Federation, have almost the same precepts. The values in these world religions are very close, if not identical. And the Russian authorities have always cherished the culture and the religions of peoples admitted into the fold of the Russian state, which served as the cornerstone of security and stability of the Russian nation, of the Russian people, because all peoples, almost all peoples living here, view Russia as their motherland. Say, if there are people coming to the US from Latin America, or there are migrants coming to Europe, very often they come from their historical land to European countries, whereas those who profess other religions than Orthodox Christianity in Russia still view Russia as their motherland. We are all one big family, and our traditional values are very close. I said this is one big family, but each family also includes other smaller families, and this is the basic foundation of our society. And if the family has tight-knit connections, then that is exactly the case, because you cannot assure a normal future for your children unless you ensure a normal future for the whole country.
But can I say that the one way in which the religions are different is that Christianity is specifically a nonviolent religion. Jesus says, turn the other cheek, don't kill. How can a leader who has to kill, of any country, how can a leader be a Christian? How do you reconcile that to yourself?
Well, it's easier to reconcile if you need to protect yourself, your family, your country. We have not attacked anyone. What was the starting point of the developments in Ukraine? The starting point was the coup d'etat, as well as the flare-up of violence in Donbass. And we are protecting ourselves, our people, our country, and our future. As far as religion in general is concerned, the thing is, it does not manifest mostly externally. It's not just about going to church every day and kneeling to the ground. Religion resides within your heart. This is our culture. It's very human-oriented. Dostoevsky is very well known in the West as a genius of the Russian culture and the Russian literature. And he spoke about that a lot. He spoke about the Russian soul. The thing is, Western society is more pragmatic, whereas a Russian is more concerned about eternal things, moral things, values. Maybe you'll disagree with me, but I think Western culture is more pragmatic. I'm not saying this is a bad thing. This is what gives the golden billion the chance to show some very good achievements in practical terms, in science. The thing is, we look the same, but our conscience, our mindset are somewhat different.
Well, so do you see the supernatural at work as you look out across what's happening in the world now? Do you see God at work? Do you ever think to yourself, these are forces that are not human?
No, honestly, I don't think that. I think the world community is developing following the inherent laws, and these laws are what they are, and there's no escaping that. It was always like that in mankind's history. Some countries rose, some peoples got bigger, got stronger, and then they left the international stage, losing the quality they had been accustomed to. Well, let's look at Genghis Khan or the Golden Horde and the conquerors, or let's remember the Roman Empire. You know, you might think that there was nothing greater than Roman history in the history of mankind, but then the barbarians got stronger, got more numerous, and Rome fell. They had a head start, their economy started to grow stronger, and the regime imposed by the Roman Empire fell apart. But it took 5 centuries. The Roman Empire had been disintegrating for 5 centuries. The difference from the current state of affairs consists in the fact that right now the developments are far more rapid than they used to be during the Roman times.
So when does the AI empire start, do you think?
You're asking increasingly more complicated questions. In order to respond to this question, you would need to be an expert in big numbers, in big data, in AI. The thing is, humanity is facing a lot of threats in terms of genetics, for instance, because right now geneticists can go as far as to, create a specialized human being like an athlete or a genetically engineered military man.
What do you think of that?
And a chip has been incorporated into the brain by Elon Musk. Well, I think there's no stopping Elon Musk. He's going to do what he thinks he needs to do. But you need, I don't know, to find some common ground with him. You have to search for ways to persuade him. I think he's a smart person, and you've got to, come to an agreement, come to terms with him. This process needs to be formalized and subjected to certain rules. Humanity has to give some thought to what's going to happen to humanity due to the new developments in genetics or in AI. You can forecast what's going to happen in a more or less accurate fashion. But once humanity felt an existential threat coming from nuclear weapons, back then all countries who possessed such weapons decided to come to terms with one another because they understood that nuclear weaponry could drive humanity to extinction. So once an understanding comes that unbridled development of AI or genetics or other fields, which cannot be stemmed, you can't stop them. Research is going to continue, as it was impossible to, prevent powder from being used. And once humanity understands that the threat comes from these fields, then the time will come to an agreement on an interstate basis, intergovernmental basis, on how to regulate these fields.
I appreciate all the time you've given us. I just got to ask you one last question, and that's about someone who's very famous in the United States, probably not here, Evan Gershkovich, who's the Wall Street Journal reporter. He's 32, and he's been in prison for almost a year. This is a huge story in the United States, and I just want to ask you directly, without getting into the details of it or your version of what happened, if as a sign of your decency, you would be willing to release him to us and we'll bring him back to the United States.
Well, we've done so many gestures of goodwill out of decency that I think we've run out of them. Because we've never seen anyone reciprocate to us in a similar manner. But on the whole, we are willing to talk. We do not rule out that we can do that if there is movement to accommodate us on the other side. And when I talk about the partners, I'm talking about our special services, and the special services are in contact with one another. They are talking about this subject. There is no taboo on discussing this issue. It can be solved, and we're willing to solve it. But there are certain terms that need to be met that are discussed via special services channels. I think an agreement can be reached.
So typically, I mean, this stuff has happened for obviously centuries. One country catches another spy within its borders, it trades it for one of its own intel guys in another country. I think what makes, and it's not my business, but what makes this different is the guy's obviously not a spy, he's a kid. And maybe he was breaking your law in some way, but he's not a super spy, and everybody knows that, and he's being held hostage in exchange, which is true. With respect, it's true, and everyone knows it's true. So maybe he's in a different category. Maybe it's not fair to ask for somebody else in exchange for letting him out. Maybe it degrades Russia to do that.
Вы знаете, можно как угодно говорить,
well, you can give different interpretations to what constitutes a spy, but there are some things under law. If a person gets some secret information, does that confidentially, then that is qualified as espionage, and that is precisely what he was doing. He was receiving some confidential information. He's getting that information in secret. Maybe he'd been implicated in that. Maybe he did that out of his own volition or due to carelessness, but as facts stand, this is qualified under law as espionage, and he was caught red-handed when he was receiving that information, and it's been proven. So, if it had been some far-fetched excuse, some fabrication, then it would have been a different story. But he was caught red-handed when he was getting in secret some confidential information.
But are you suggesting that he was working for the U.S. government or NATO, or he was just a reporter who was given material he wasn't supposed to have? Those seem like very different things.
Я не знаю, на кого он работал.
I don't know who he was working for, but I would like to reiterate that getting confidential information in secret is called espionage. Maybe he might have worked under the banner of the American Special Services. I don't think he was working for Monaco, even though Monaco might be interested in getting that information. But it's up to the special services to come to an agreement, and some groundwork has been laid. There are people who, in our view, are not tied to special services. There is a person serving a sentence in an ally country, in a country that is an ally of the U.S., and that person, due to patriotic sentiment, eliminated some bandits in one of the European capitals. During the developments at the Caucasus, do you know what he was doing? I don't want to say that, but I'll do that anyway. he was laying our soldiers taken prisoner on the road, and then he drove his car over their heads. What kind of a person is that? Do you think that's a human being? And, a patriot decided to eliminate that beast, and one of the European countries, he did that on his own volition, or not? Well, that is a different question.
Yeah, but Evan Gershkovich didn't do that. I mean, that's a completely different. I mean, this is a 32-year-old newspaper reporter.
He is not just a journalist. He's a journalist who was getting confidential information in secret. Yes, that's different, but still, I'm telling you about other people who are basically controlled by the U.S. authorities, wherever they are serving a prison sentence. And there is an ongoing dialogue among the special services, and this has to be done in a calm, responsible, professional manner. The contacts are ongoing, so let them do their work. I do not rule out that the person you've referred to can go back to his country, Mr. Gershkovich. Moreover, it would be senseless to keep him in prison in Russia. But we want our counterparts. The special services in the U.S. should also think about helping our special services in achieving their goals. So we are willing to talk. Moreover, these talks are continuing, and there were many successful examples of these talks crowned with success, and maybe this is going to be crowned with success as well, but we have to come to an agreement.
I hope you let him out. Mr. President, thank you.
Well, I would also want him to go home, and I'm absolutely sincere with you. But let me say once again, the dialogue continues. The more public we render things of this nature, the more difficult it becomes to resolve them.
I wonder if that's true with the war, though. Also, I mean, I guess I want to ask one more question, which is, and maybe you don't want to say so for strategic reasons, but are you worried that what's happening in Ukraine could lead to something much larger and much more horrible? And how motivated are you just to call the U.S. government and say, let's come to terms?
Well, listen, I think I said that. We do not refuse to talk, to negotiate. We're willing to do that. It's the Western side, and Ukraine is a satellite country for the U.S. It's evident. I don't want you to take that as a swear word, no. But we understand that that is what is happening. The financial support is there. It's enormous. Germany is following suit. Dozens of billions of US dollars are fueled into Ukraine. There's a huge influx of arms, of weapons. So probably you should tell the current Ukrainian leadership, well, let's stop, let's sit at the negotiating table, rescind this absurd decree.
Sure, but you already said it. I didn't think you meant it as an insult, because you already said correctly, it's been reported that Ukraine was prevented from negotiating a peace settlement by the former British Prime Minister acting on behalf of the Biden administration. So of course they're a satellite. Big countries control small countries. That's not new. And that's why I asked about dealing directly with the Biden administration, which is making these decisions, not President Zelensky of Ukraine.
Well, if Zelensky administration in Ukraine refuses to talk, then I think they've got the instructions from Washington. That's what I assume. Well, you should explain to Washington that this is not the right pretext. They have to, come up with some explanation which is not gonna insult anyone. So it was not our decision, it was their decision, and it is up to them to rescind that decision, to go back on it. But they took the wrong decision. So why we are the ones to find out a way out? We don't need to correct their mistakes. If it's their mistake, they have to correct it themselves.
So I just want to make sure I'm not misunderstanding what you're saying. I don't think that I am. I think you're saying you want a negotiated settlement to what's happening in Ukraine.
Правильно. Но мы же добились этого.
Right, and we were there.
Большой документ.
There was a very huge document which we prepared in Istanbul, and it was initialed by the head of the Ukrainian delegation. He opposed his signature to the document, and we published some of the provisions. He put his signature, and he said they were willing to sign it, and the war would have been over 18 months ago, but Prime Minister Johnson came, and he dissuaded us, and we missed that chance. Yes, it's a mistake, but let them get back to that. It's as simple as that. Why do we need to bother ourselves and correct others' mistakes? Well, yes, you can say that this might have been our mistake, that we have decided to escalate and use weapons, arms, to put an end to the war that started back in 2014. But let me get you back further to history. I told you, let's get back to 1991. When a promise was given to us not to expand NATO, or let's get back to 2008, when the doors were open to NATO, or let's get back to the Ukrainian Declaration of Independence that proclaimed it as a neutral state, or let's get back to the developments when American and British bases started to be set up in Ukraine, or let's get back to 2014, the coup d'etat, but it's senseless. You can go back to history and go to and fro ad infinitum. It's a mistake, yes, but let them correct that, and we are willing to talk.
Do you think it's too humiliating at this point for NATO to accept Russian control of what was 2 years ago Ukrainian territory?
Я же сказал.
Well, I said that.
Я же сказал, что пусть подумают, как сделать.
Let them think how to come out of this in a dignified manner,
Желание есть.
if the will is there.
До сих пор шумели, кричали.
Up until now, there's been a lot of talk about the need to secure a strategic defeat on the battlefield against Russia. Right now, they're coming to realize that it's impossible. I think it's impossible. It's never going to happen inherently. And I think they're coming to realize that. I mean, those who control powers in the West, and once the realization has set in, they have to think about that, and we're willing to talk. Moreover,
Would you be willing to say, congratulations, NATO, you won, and just keep the situation where it is now?
Ну, вы знаете, это предмет переговоров.
well, this is a matter for talks, for negotiation.
Который с нами никто не хочет вести.
And no one is willing to talk about
Или, точнее сказать,
that with us. Well, maybe they want talks, and I know they do want. It's not just I see that, I know the will is there, but they don't know how to go about that. They've driven the situation to the point where we are at.
а наши партнеры, оппоненты до этого.
And we're not the ones to have done that. It's our partners, our counterparts. Okay, it happened, but they have to think about how to reverse the situation. But maybe we shouldn't say that on camera.
Да, было бы смешно, если бы не было так грустно. Это
It would be funny if it were not so sad, and this incessant mobilization in Ukraine,
истерика там.
the hysteria,
Проблемы.
the domestic problems they've been plunged into, sooner or later
Вот что, знаете, что
will come to
может даже странно в сегодняшней
an
ситуации.
agreement. I know it might sound bizarre in the current situation,
Отношения
but be that as it may,
между народами
the relations between the two peoples will be rebuilt. It'll take a lot of time, but they will heal.
отличные примеры.
And there are, some examples.
Происходит боестолкновение. Конкретный пример. Вот
Well,
сейчас, секундочку.
to cite an example,
Украинские солдаты попали в окружение.
the Ukrainian soldiers were encircled. I'm just drawing this example from real life. Our soldiers were shouting to them, "There's no chance, surrender yourselves and you'll go out alive." And they are shouting, speaking perfect Russian, saying, "Russians do not surrender," from the Ukrainian. So what is happening currently, to a certain extent, is an element of civil war. And everyone in the West think that the hostilities have driven a wedge into these two nations, splitting them apart forever. But it's not going to happen. They will get back together. Why are the Ukrainian authorities dismantling the Ukrainian Orthodox Church? Because it brings together not just the territory, it brings together our souls and hearts. And no one will be able to separate that soul. Shall we end here, or is there anything else?
No, I think that's great. Thank you, Mr. President.
Спасибо большое.
Спасибо.
Thank you.